Hey, this is Echoplex. I know it's been 7 months, but I wanted to drop some quick audio about climate change, and I realized that I'm not any type of ologist, and that I'm not a scientist. I thought it was important, since I was trying to do a social thing, that we could get into the questions about climate change, not just the reasons, not the scientific evidence everyone knows, but the questions from the naysayers who have certainly held us back from changing anything. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, and I would say most of you do, the three types of climate change denial are conspiracy, economics, and religious. So I figured what I'd do is I would go in order. Now, the conspiracy theorists seem to think that climatologists want us to use carbon credits. And what carbon credits are for allow people to pollute, but they'd have to pay more in taxes. And you always hear people bring up Al Gore and carbon credits and things like that. And, it's just a ridiculous conspiracy theory. So whenever you hear anything about carbon credits, realize it's a some kind of weird conspiracy where people believe climatologists are going to try to have a monopoly on the economic impacts of the world, and it's just one of those things where if you spread it out all over the planet, that it wouldn't make sense. The conspiracy quickly falls apart as soon as you cross out of the borders of the United States. But another point, actually think it's a more fine point, is the economics of doing something about climate change, because they ask the question a lot, moving over to solar and wind power and everything, how is that going to affect the economics of the United States? Other than creating some kind of industry boom for people who are building those facilities and everything, I know will be a small impact. But also, as far as the economics of it, you have to consider the fact that these fossil fuels are finite. They will run out eventually. Why not plan ahead? Why not put money into solar and wind and power and go ahead and move it over and stop, polluting the earth? The bees are dying off. All the world's fish are dying off. I mean, it's not something that, they really cover on the news, because they realize that it's going to get into climate change. We have two factions of people in the United States, at least, you know, and they are vitriolic, belligerent, and a lot of the vitriol coming from the far right in the United States is just spiteful. But see, that's the thing about the economics of it, is that I don't understand. We eventually did come together on CFCs and ban the production of CFCs in the United States. But I understand, I understand that's why we pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, is because India and China and other countries with large carbon footprints weren't going to change anything. But what we could have been doing at the time, we could have been working on high-speed rail. We could have been the pioneers in solar and wind energy and sold it to those countries. It's ridiculous whenever you look at a country like, like China, that has oil needs and things like that, and thinking that they're not under the illusion that fossil fuels are infinite. There's no way. I mean, there's no way in the world. They don't have like a religious doctrine that would tell them that God is capricious and they'll never run out of fossil fuels, because God loves them. That's one of the religious arguments for not going renewable energy in the United States, is that God will never allow it to happen. I mean, and that's one of the hardest things to actually speak on. Like I've said before, I realize there is a movement out there called like Resisting the Green Dragon, which teaches that being a good steward of the land is somehow Satanism. And I realize that that's something that Christian dominionists do. They are an extreme faction in the United States. So, a lot of people miss those little things from them. That is something they are actually teaching their flock. We could have been the leaders, the innovators in solar and wind. We're falling behind because you have these people who know that these fossil fuels are finite, but they want to run the clock out before anything actually happens. They're not considering the future. They're just considering next quarter, next quarter, next quarter, next quarter. We have hundreds of thousands of deaths every year directly related to burning fossil fuels. And that's one of the ways that detractors of wind energy attack renewables, is saying that bird deaths is a reason not to use renewable energy. Birds being fried to death by large solar panels, birds flying into wind turbines, while easily ignoring the human deaths caused by the burning of fossil fuels. And I mean, I realize that a lot of that is a mocking tone of, hey, environmentalists, you're killing birds by trying to use these renewable energy sources. It's just, but I think what you have to realize is those are no way answers. Those are spiteful, deflective questions that try to ignore the questions about what we're going to do whenever this finite resource runs out. So whenever someone says, what about the birds? What about the killing off the birds population using solar and wind? That's just a deflective question. I realize that, it's true that those things actually do kill animals in the vicinity of them. But, it's nowhere near the human cost of using fossil fuels. But the real question is, what do you do when these finite resources run out? What do we do? What do we turn to? See, that's why, even without climate change, it's important to focus on wind and solar because of the pollution aspects, because of the finite aspects, a major source of energy eventually running out. I mean, it's not a ridiculous question to ask, what do we do after this? It's also not a, ignorant question to ask, what do we do whenever we see a place like Dubai building complete walled city running on nothing but renewable energy resources? Do we actually just sit there and ignore something like that, something taking place, some country, and a very oil rich country, stepping leaps and bounds ahead of us on a problem that we know is coming and we're completely ignoring? Things which, if you ignore, comes down to you being either completely malice to future generations or completely ignorant to the actual eventuality of fossil fuels running out. Or a third option, the religious option, where people who believe, young earth creationists and dominionist Christians believing that the earth will never run out of fossil fuels. It's a part of their doctrine that God would never allow something like that to happen to people in the United States, which is really weird considering if you look at something like the Black Plague or the Inquisition, which killed off a third of the population of Europe, and then the Inquisition killed off another third of the population of Europe. While I realize my comparison is very strawman-like, which it is, and believe me, I completely understand that. But the only thing that I'm trying to say is for people to go around and somehow their religious doctrine has turned into their political doctrine, and they think because they support certain things politically that somehow that's going to transverse over into their religion, and just because they like oil and fossil fuels and things like that so much means that their God would never allow things like that to run out until like the end of time. And what you're dealing with anyway are people who already completely deny science. I mean, it's not a great leap to go from believing the world is 6,000 years old to your God would never allow the world to run out of fossil fuels so you could keep driving your Hummer. But with that being said, it would be a true disservice if you actually stopped paying attention to these people whenever you consider how much political power they actually have, because they at least totally control one half of American politics. And if you and I realize that there are people out there on the Republican or conservative or libertarian side who would say that, they don't actually control anything. Yeah, we placate to them and blah, blah, blah. But, whenever you have the head of the science committee saying that he believes that all science is words from Satan straight from hell, and then you have political debates where they ask people to raise their hand if they believe in evolution, and no one on the Republican right raised their hands in support of it, and then then they all raise their hand for 6,000-year-old creationism. You don't have much of a footing to go and pretend like they're ignoring them. You don't have much of a footing to go pretend like they're just placating to them, because at that point their insane zealot doctrine just became your political doctrine. So you can't pretend like they don't own you. And whenever a group creates that much fear, you can't pretend, you really cannot pretend at all that you're not supporting a Taliban-like theocracy. And that's truly what all of the climate change denial in the United States is, bowing down to a bunch of religious zealots. I understand the economic problems of it, but what I don't understand is the ability for them to completely derail, make perverse the idea of coming up with renewable energy, because their doctrine holds that whenever we run out of fossil fuels, their God is coming back to claim them. And that's what you're falling into. That's what you've just become. That is what, the Republican Party in the United States has become. It's become a bunch of religious zealots. Because looking at it from any other aspects, you can't see any other reason other than kowtowing to a bunch of religious leaders that they would completely laugh off solar. They would completely laugh off wind, because they're planning for the end of the world. They're not planning for any future generations They want the world to end. And I think that's what a lot of people, I'm not even going to pretend like they're on the other side of the aisle from me. They're not. They're living in some type of alternate reality where being controlled like this, is somehow good for them and it's good for me and it's what they want to bring me under the influence of. That's why when assholes like Glenn Beck say that they want climate change to hurry up so they don't have to be cold in the winter anymore. Because what they're actually looking for is the end of the world, and that's what they want. That's why, everything for them becomes nuclear fire. Every political disagreement with another country becomes just fucking glass them. And that's what all the doubt is. That's why that's why their political leaders are afraid to say there's a possibility of there's such a thing as climate change, is because they were afraid of the crazy religious fundamentalists. And really, it's no different than the Taliban. The things that they're doing in the United States is no different. And that's what a lot of this is. It's just anti-science, anti-intellectualism. And I know some very smart people who are falling into it, and they can defend it any way they want to, but they can't pretend like, they haven't become the slave bitches of evangelical Christianity, because they have. They've been totally kowtowed. They won't even speak out against any of it. But that's exactly what climate change denial is about. It's about religious zealotry, and it's insane. You worry about Sharia law and Muslims taking over, and we're doing much, much worse to ourselves out of the fear. It's the same thing as like what happened after 9/11, where we allowed, so many of our personal rights out of fear. But anyway, I mean, that's all I really have to say about this. I mean, I realize that there's a lot of people who are going to take offense to the last part of this show because I really don't like going into religion. You can't see any other reason why there'd be climate change denial, because the first one's a conspiracy and it doesn't hold up. The second one don't make any sense because there's no planning for the future. There's no planning for in game whenever fossil fuels finally run out. And you can't tell me they are that actually ignorant of the situation of what's coming in the future. You can't tell me they're willing to kick the football that far down the road and pretend like it's never coming, because they want the war to end all wars. They believe that's the only way, and they believe that's the only recourse. But anyway, that's enough of this particular rant, and I realize that my monologues drag on and on because I just talk until I have nothing else to say. And I hope it was at least coherent, and maybe next time Lucas and Lee can join me.